EMTs, what's the most unhinged thing a nurse has ever asked you to do? I was asked to perform a miracle at Briarwood Elder Care on a freezing Wednesday in January at 2:15 in the morning. We got the call around 2:15. Dispatcher said unresponsive resident at a nursing home. Routine. We loaded up and drove over. 12 minutes. The night nurse was waiting at the front desk. Her name was Tamsin. She was about 45, wearing scrubs covered in cartoon cats that looked more alert than she did. She had the posture of a woman who had been running on caffeine and spite since yesterday afternoon. She said, "Thank God you're here. He's in room 14. Hurry." I said, "What's the situation?" She said, "He's unresponsive." I said, "For how long?" She said, "I checked it too, and he wasn't responding." I said, "When was the last check before that?" She looked at her clipboard like it had personally betrayed her and said 10:30. I said, "Tamsin, that's nearly 4 hours." She said, "We were short-staffed." She said it like that explained everything. Like being short-staffed meant the laws of medicine and basic human monitoring just took the night off too. Gibbs and I walked to room 14. I opened the door. I am going to be respectful here because this man was someone's grandfather, and he deserved dignity. His name was Mr. Kendrick. He was in his bed. He was on his back, and he was dead. Not freshly dead. Not maybe dead. Not possibly dead. Dead. The kind of dead where you don't need equipment or training or a medical degree. The kind of dead where a child could walk in and say that man is not alive and they'd be right. Rigor mortis had set in. His jaw was fixed. His hands were curled. His skin had changed color. This man had left the building hours ago. His soul had packed a bag, checked out of the front desk, and was probably already halfway through the orientation tour of wherever souls go. I turned to Gibbs. Gibbs looked at me. He looked at Mr. Kendrick. He looked back at me. His face said absolutely not. My face said I know. I turned to Tamsin and said, "Ma'am, I'm very sorry, but this patient has passed away." She said, "Yes, I know, that's why I called you." I said, "There's nothing we can do for him. He's been gone for quite a while." She tilted her head like a confused parrot and said, "What do you mean nothing you can do?" I said, "He's deceased." She said, "I'm aware." I said, "Okay, so we're on the same page." She said, "So revive him." I want you to understand that she said this with complete sincerity. She didn't whisper it. She didn't phrase it as a question. She said revive him the way you'd say pass the salt, like it was the most obvious and reasonable next step in this situation. I said, "We can't revive him." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because he is dead." She said, "That's literally why people call 911. I said, "People call 911 for emergencies. This is not an emergency. An emergency implies that something is currently happening. Nothing is currently happening in room 14. Nothing has happened in room 14 for several hours. Room 14 is the least active room in this building." She crossed her arms and said, "So you're not even going to try?" I said, "Try what?" She said, "CPR, a defibrillator, adrenaline, whatever you have in those bags." I said, "Tamsin, his body is in rigor mortis." She said, "So what?" I said, "So that means his muscles have locked due to chemical changes that occur hours after death. It means resuscitation is not possible. It is not a gray area. It is not a judgment call. It is not a matter of trying harder. You cannot restart what has already gone through the biological process of shutting down completely." She said, "Well, I've seen people come back from worse." I stared at her. Gibbs stared at her. I have been doing this job for 8 years. Gibbs has been doing it for 11. Between us, we have responded to thousands of calls. Neither of us, in our combined 19 years of emergency medicine, has ever seen anyone come back from rigor mortis. Nobody has. In the entire recorded history of the human species, the number of people who have come back from rigor mortis is exactly 0. It has never happened. Not once. Not in a hospital, not in a field, not in a movie that claims to be based on a true story. I said, "Tamsin, what have you seen that was worse than rigor mortis?" She said, "A man flatlined for 6 minutes once and they brought him back." I said, "Yes, because he had been dead for 6 minutes, not 6 hours. There is a difference between those two numbers." She didn't seem to agree that there was a meaningful difference between 6 minutes and 6 hours. In Tamsin's mind, dead was dead, and our job was to undead people regardless of how long they'd been in that condition. I'm honestly surprised she didn't ask us to swing by the cemetery on our way out and see if we could do anything for the residents there too. I said, "Tamsin, I need you to understand clearly that I am not performing chest compressions on this man." She said, "Then what am I supposed to do?" I said, "You call the on-call physician, get him pronounced, contact the family, and follow your facility's procedures for post-mortem care." She said, "I can't pronounce him." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the on-call physician is Dr. Hadley." I said, "Okay, call Dr. Hadley." She said, "Dr. Hadley doesn't answer his phone after midnight." I said, "That is literally the entire point of being on call." She said, "I've tried 3 times already." She showed me her phone. 3 outgoing calls to Dr. Hadley between 1:47 and 2:12, all under 15 seconds. She hadn't even let it ring long enough to go to voicemail. She'd called him like she was testing whether her phone worked, not like she was trying to reach a physician about a dead man. I said, "Call him again and let it ring." She sighed like I was asking her to solve a differential equation and dialed. It rang and rang and rang. 14 rings. I counted. Then a voice picked up that sounded like it had been dragged out of a coma at the bottom of a lake. Dr. Hadley said, "What?" Tamsin said, "We have a situation." He said, "What kind of situation?" She said, "A resident is unresponsive." He said, "Give him oxygen and call me in the morning." Tamsin looked at me. I looked at the phone. I took it out of her hand. I said, "Dr. Hadley, this is paramedic Voss with County EMS. The resident is not unresponsive. The resident is deceased. He's in full rigor mortis and needs to be pronounced." There was a long pause. Dr. Hadley said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I am very sure. I have never been more sure of anything in my professional life." He said, "Well, I can't pronounce him over the phone." I said, "I understand that." He said, "Someone needs to examine the body." I said, "Yes, that is standard protocol." He said, "Can you do it?" I said, "No, I cannot pronounce a death. I am a paramedic. That requires a physician or a registered nurse with the proper delegation." He said, "Can the nurse do it?" I said, "That's between you and the nurse and your facility's policies." He said, "Hold hold on, let me check. I heard rustling, then silence, then what I can only describe as a snore. Dr. Hadley had fallen back asleep, on the phone, during a death call. Gibbs was leaning against the doorframe of room 14 with his arms crossed, watching this unfold like it was a nature documentary about institutional failure. I called Dr. Hadley back. He answered on the 9th ring. I said, Dr. Hadley, you fell asleep. He said, I did not. I said, you did. I heard you snoring. He said, that was my dog. I said, your dog snores in the exact cadence and pitch of a 60-year-old man in REM sleep. He said, it's a big dog. I said, Dr. Hadley, I need you to either come to this facility and pronounce this patient, or authorize Nurse Tamsin to make the pronouncement under your delegation. He said, fine. Tell her she can pronounce him. Just have her document the time. I said, what time should she use? He said, whatever time it is now. I said, the patient has been dead for several hours. He said, then use an estimated time. I said, estimated based on what? He said, I don't know. You're the one standing there. Use your judgment. I said, my judgment says this man has been dead since approximately 10 or 11 p.m. based on the degree of rigor. He said, fine, put that. I said, I'm not putting anything. I didn't pronounce him. I'm telling you what I'm observing, so your nurse can document it properly. He said, right, fine, just handle it. Then he hung up. Handle it. 2 words that meant absolutely nothing and transferred all responsibility to everyone except the person being paid to be responsible. I handed the phone back to Tamsin. I said, Dr. Hadley has authorized you to pronounce Mr. Kendrick. She stared at me. She said, I've never pronounced anyone before. I said, it's not complicated. You confirm the absence of pulse, breathing, and reflexes, note the time, and document it in the chart. She said, I know what pronouncing means. I said, then what's the problem? She said, I just don't want to be the one who says it. I said, says what? She said that he's dead. I said, Tamsin, you called us here because he's dead. You told us he was dead. You asked us to revive him from being dead. You have used the word dead or some version of it approximately 9 times in this conversation. She said, that's different. I said, how? She said, because if I pronounce him, it's official. I looked at Mr. Kendrick. Then I looked at Tamsin. Then I looked at Gibbs. Gibbs had the expression of a man who was mentally calculating how many years he had left until retirement and whether this single call was going to age him past that number. I said, Tamsin, Mr. Kendrick does not require your verbal confirmation to be dead. He has achieved that status independently. Your pronouncement is a legal formality. It does not cause the death. It acknowledges the death. He will not become more or less dead based on whether you write it on a piece of paper. She chewed her lip and said, can you at least be in the room when I do it? I said, yes. She said, okay. She walked to the bedside. She put her stethoscope on. She placed it on Mr. Kendrick's chest and listened for about 45 seconds. Then she looked at me with genuine surprise and said, there's no heartbeat. I said, correct. She said, his lungs aren't working either. I said, also correct. She said, his pupils are fixed and dilated. I said, the streak continues. She stood there for a moment, stethoscope still in her ears, staring down at Mr. Kendrick like she was waiting for him to sit up and tell her it was all a prank. Then she pulled out her clipboard and wrote something down. She said, okay, I've pronounced him. Time of death, 2:41 a.m. I said, you need to note an estimated actual time of death as well, based on clinical presentation. She said, what should I put? I said, based on the rigor and lividity, I'd estimate sometime between 9 and 11 p.m. She wrote it down. Then she looked up and said, now what? I said, now you contact the family. She said, at 2 in the morning. I said, yes. She said, they're going to be upset. I said, they're going to be upset regardless. She said, can it wait until morning? I said, Tamsin, you have a deceased resident in a bed. The family has a legal right to be notified promptly. You cannot just leave Mr. Kendrick here until a more socially acceptable hour because you don't want to make an awkward phone call. She said, I don't have the family's number. I said, it's in his chart. She said, the chart is at the nurse's station. I said, then go to the nurse's station. She didn't move. She said, can you come with me? I said, why? She said, because I don't want to walk down the hall alone. I said, the hall is 30 feet long. She said, it's dark. I said, you work the night shift. She said, exactly. It's always dark. I hate it. Gibbs made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been his soul trying to leave his body. We walked with Tamsin to the nurse's station. She pulled up Mr. Kendrick's file on a computer that looked like it ran on Windows 98 and Prayer. She found the emergency contact, his daughter, a woman named Lorraine Kendrick Walsh. The number was a landline. Tamsin picked up the desk phone, dialed, and waited. Someone answered. I could hear the groggy confusion from 3 feet away. Tamsin said, hello, this is Briarwood Elder Care calling about your father. Then she said, I'm sorry to inform you that your father has passed away tonight. There was a pause. Then I heard a voice on the other end say what happened. Tamsin said he was found unresponsive during a routine check. Another pause. The daughter asked what time. Tamsin looked at me. I mouthed the words estimated 9 to 11. Tamsin said, we believe it happened sometime this evening. The daughter said, this evening. Tamsin said, yes. The daughter said, it's almost 3 in the morning. You're just calling me now. Tamsin said, we wanted to make sure before we contacted you. The daughter said, make sure of what? Make sure he was dead. Tamsin said, well, yes. The daughter's voice got very quiet, and she said, how long was my father lying there alone before anyone noticed? Tamsin looked at me again. I did not help her this time. There are moments in this job where you step back and let the person holding the clipboard face the consequences of what's written on it. Tamsin said, we check on residents regularly throughout the night. The daughter said, that's not what I asked. How long? Tamsin said, I'm not sure of the exact timeline. The daughter said, I want to speak to a supervisor. Tamsin said, the supervisor isn't here overnight. The daughter said, then I'll be there in 40 minutes and I want every piece of documentation from tonight ready when I arrive. She hung up. The dial tone filled the nurse's station for about 3 seconds before Tamsin slowly placed the receiver down. She stared at the phone like the phone itself had wronged her, like the phone had taken the daughter's side and was now judging her too. She said she sounded really mad. I said yes. She said, this is going to be a problem. I said yes. She said, can you stay until she gets here? I said no. She said, why not? I said because our job was to respond to a medical emergency, and this was not a medical emergency when we arrived, and it is even less of one now. She said, but what if the daughter yells at me? I said, then she yells at you. She said, that's not helpful. I said, Tamsin, I've done everything I can do here. The patient has been pronounced. The family has been notified. My run report is complete. I need to go back in service because somewhere in this county right now, there might be a person who is having an actual emergency, the kind where they are currently alive and would like to stay that way, and I need to be available for that person. She said, fine. Then she said one more thing. I said, what? She said, room 22. I said, what about room 22? She said, Mrs. Delacroix. She's been coughing a lot tonight and I think she might have pneumonia. I said, has she been evaluated? She said, no. I said, does she have a fever? She said, I didn't take her temperature. I said, is she in respiratory distress? She said, I don't know. I said, you don't know if your patient is in respiratory distress. She said, I've been busy. I said, busy doing what? She looked at me with complete sincerity and said, dealing with room 14. I said, you've been dealing with room 14 since 2:15. What were you doing from 10:30 to 2:15? She said, charting. I said, you were charting for 3.5 hours. She said, there was a lot to chart. I said, what could you possibly have been charting for 3.5 hours while your residents were unmonitored? She said, I was behind on my notes from last week. I took a slow breath. Gibbs put his hand on my shoulder, which is the Gibbs equivalent of a 10-minute therapy session. I said, show me room 22. We walked to room 22. Mrs. Delacroix was a small woman in her 80s, awake and sitting up, which was already a better start than room 14. She was coughing, but it was a productive cough, not the rattling wet kind that makes you grab an oxygen mask. Her color was fine. Her breathing was slightly labored, but not critical. I checked her vitals. Temperature was 101. Oxygen was 94%. Blood pressure was normal for her age. I listened to her lungs. Some crackles in the lower left, consistent with early pneumonia or bronchitis. Treatable, manageable. The kind of thing that gets caught when someone actually checks on their patients. I said she needs to see a physician. She probably needs antibiotics and a chest x-ray. She is stable right now, but if this goes untreated, it could get serious. Tamsin said, so, should I call Dr. Hadley? I said yes. She said he's not going to answer. I said he answered for me. She said, you're scarier than I am. I couldn't argue with that. I said, call him. Tell him you have a resident with a low-grade fever, reduced oxygen saturation, and abnormal lung sounds. If he doesn't answer, document every attempt and call the backup physician. She said, we don't have a backup physician. I said, what do you mean you don't have a backup? She said, Dr. Hadley is the only one contracted with our facility. I said, so if Dr. Hadley doesn't answer, you have no medical coverage for 32 residents. She said, we have me. I let that sit for a moment. 32 elderly residents in the middle of the night with one nurse who had just asked me to perform CPR on a man in rigor mortis. I thought about every single resident behind every single door in that hallway. I thought about the ones who were sleeping peacefully and the ones who might not be. I thought about the 4 hours between Tamsin's checks and what could have happened in any of those rooms during that window. I thought about Mrs. Delacroix sitting in room 22 with pneumonia brewing in her lungs, waiting for someone to notice. I filled out my report in the ambulance. Gibbs drove. Neither of us said a word for the first 5 minutes. The streetlights were that sick orange color that makes everything look like it's happening inside a bruise. The roads were empty. It was 3:20 in the morning and the whole county was asleep except for us and Tamsin and Mr. Kendrick, though Mr. Kendrick had an excuse. Gibbs said that's the worst one yet. I said yeah. He said that man was probably dead before she even started her shift. I said probably. He said, and she wanted us to do CPR. I said she wanted us to do CPR on a man whose joints had locked. He said on a man who was room temperature. I said on a man who had been dead long enough to have missed dinner, evening meds, a shift change, and probably a Jeopardy rerun. Gibbs shook his head slowly, the way he does when something has genuinely rattled him. Gibbs doesn't rattle easily. This is a man who once intubated a patient while standing in 4 inches of floodwater without changing his facial expression. He said, I need to retire. I said, you've been saying that for 6 years. He said, this time I mean it. I said, you said that last time too. He said, last time we didn't have a nurse asking us to resurrect the dead. He said that woman looked me in the eye and asked why we weren't trying harder. Like death is a customer service issue and we just needed to escalate the ticket. I called county dispatch and reported the conditions at Briarwood, staffing levels, the gap in monitoring, the lack of backup physician coverage, Mrs. Delacroix's untreated symptoms. They said they'd forward it to the state health department. I followed up with a written report to our medical director the next morning. 2 weeks later, the state conducted an unannounced inspection of Briarwood elder care. They found 17 deficiencies, inadequate staffing ratios, incomplete resident monitoring logs, missing documentation on 3 other deaths over the past year, deaths that had suspiciously vague timelines and sparse notes, medication errors that hadn't been reported, equipment that hadn't been serviced, call lights that had been disabled in 4 rooms because the sound bothered the night staff. 4 rooms. 4 rooms where a resident could have pressed a button and screamed into the void and nobody would have heard. The facility was fined $48,000 and put on a corrective action plan. Dr. Hadley was removed as the contracted physician after the state board reviewed his response times and patient outcomes. He had apparently been unreachable on 6 other occasions that year alone. On 2 of those occasions, residents had been transported to the hospital with conditions that could have been managed on site if a physician had answered his phone. One of those residents didn't make it. Dr. Hadley described himself in his response letter as a dedicated physician who occasionally experienced technical difficulties with his mobile device. 6 times in 1 year. That must be one very specific phone. Tamsin was not fired. She was reassigned to day shift, which I suppose is a kind of punishment if you hate sunlight and human oversight. 3 months later, I was at a gas station on a completely unrelated call when I recognized the cartoon cat scrub. scrubs. Tamsin was inside buying a coffee. She didn't see me. She was on her phone, talking to someone, and I heard her say, "Can you believe they wrote me up for that? He was already dead. It's not like I could have done anything." I sat in my ambulance and stared at the dashboard for a while. Then I drove back to the station. I don't think about Mr. Kendrick every day, but I think about him more often than I should. I think about him lying in room 14 while the hallway was empty, and the nurse's station was occupied by a woman catching up on last week's charting. I think about the hours between his last breath and the moment anyone bothered to check. I think about whether he called out, whether he pressed his call light, whether it was one of the 4 that had been disabled. I think about his daughter driving to that facility at 3 in the morning in January, probably still in whatever she threw on when the phone rang, and what she found when she got there. A dead father, a cold room, a nurse in cartoon cat scrubs who couldn't explain the gap. I think about Mrs. Delacroix coughing alone in room 22, while the only person responsible for her care was arguing with me about whether death was reversible. I checked on her a month later. She'd been hospitalized for pneumonia 5 days after our visit. She recovered, but it had been close. Closer than it would have been if someone had taken her temperature at 10:30 instead of charting notes from last Tuesday. This job shows you a lot. It shows you how fast things can go wrong and how brave people can be when they do. It also shows you how systems fail. Not in dramatic ways, not with alarms and flashing lights, but quietly, in dark hallways at 2 in the morning, when no one is watching, and the one person who's supposed to be doesn't think it matters. Gibbs retired 4 months later. His last shift was a Tuesday. Nothing eventful. He clocked out, shook my hand, and said, "Don't let the Tamsins win." I still haven't.